Okay, I need you to take a deep breath. I really mean it. Wherever you are right now, whether you're driving or maybe you just woke up and grabbed your phone, just stop for a second and look at the date.
Yeah.
It is Saturday, February 28th, 2026. And if you have seen a screen at all in the last few hours, you know that the world looks very, very different than it did when we went to bed last night.
It certainly does. It feels like the timeline has officially broken.
Completely broken. We are watching history unfold in real time today.
Yeah.
And it is, well, it's violent, it's chaotic, and it is massive.
Right. The old status quo is just gone.
Breaking news is absolutely flooding in from everywhere. We have confirmation now of joint U.S. and Israeli strikes all over Iran. We're talking about operation names like Roaring Lion and Operation Epic Fury.
Just massive kinetic action.
Yeah, the headlines are just screaming about cruise missiles, burning compounds in Tehran, widespread internet blackouts. But here's the thing, and this is exactly why we do these deep dives.
Yeah.
Headlines are really just the explosion at the end of the fuse.
That's a great way to put it. They tell you something went boom, but they don't tell you how long the fuse was.
Right. Or who lit it.
Exactly. And that is our mission today. We aren't just going to sit here and stare at the smoke rising over Tehran this morning. We need to look at the source material we have in front of us.
The Chronicle of Chaos.
Yes, the Chronicle of Chaos document. It is a highly detailed timeline that tracks the events of the last 60 days. Because to understand why cruise missiles are flying today, on February 28th, you really have to understand what started happening in the streets of Iran back in late 2025.
It's genuinely wild when you look at it laid out chronologically like this. It's basically a 2-month spiral. I mean, we went from people protesting the price of bread to a multi-front international war in just 60 days.
60 days.
Yeah. So let's unpack this for everyone listening. How does a domestic economic crisis mutate into what we're seeing today?
Well, and to understand that mutation, you have to go back to the spark. And as you noted, the spark wasn't initially about war with America or Israel. It was entirely about survival.
Right.
Late December 2025, the Iranian economy finally hit a fundamental breaking point. The rial collapsed. Devalued to levels we just haven't seen before. Prices for basic goods soared overnight, and people simply couldn't feed their families.
And we've seen economic protests in Iran before.
Right.
We saw them in 2019. We saw them in 2022. But the source material really emphasizes that this time was different.
Very different.
This wasn't just a few pockets of unrest. The timeline shows this was the largest wave of protest since the 1979 revolution. We're talking about demonstrations spreading to over 100 cities.
Over 100 cities. And the nature of the chants changed very quickly, too.
Sure.
Usually in the past, you might hear calls for economic reform or maybe anger directed at specific domestic policies.
Yeah.
But almost immediately this time, the timeline notes that the chants shifted to direct calls for regime change. They were demanding secular governance.
Wow.
The people weren't asking for cheaper bread anymore. They were asking for the end of the Islamic Republic.
That is a massive fundamental shift. And unfortunately, that is exactly when the regime decided to take the gloves completely off.
They did.
The timeline highlights January 8th through the 10th as the bloodiest days. And reading the details in the source here, it's honestly chilling. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei ordered a crackdown, and they didn't just use tear gas or batons.
No, they escalated immediately.
They used live ammo, shotguns, machine guns, and even drones against their own people.
Just think about that for a second. Drones. Tools usually reserved for external military enemies, turned inward against crowds of unarmed protesters. It was an absolute massacre.
Yeah.
But this brings us to a really difficult part of the analysis, which is the fog of war regarding the actual death toll.
Right, the numbers are all over the place.
Because when a regime locks down information, truth becomes the first casualty.
Yeah.
We have 3 completely different sets of numbers in our sources, and the disparity between them is staggering.
Yeah, let's look at those numbers because they tell a story on their own. So, the Iranian government officially admitted to 3,117 deaths, which honestly, even on its own, is a horrific number for just 3 days of unrest.
It's unprecedented.
But then you have the human rights groups like HRANA, and they're estimating up to 43,000 deaths.
43,000.
And then sitting right in the middle of those two extremes, you have President Trump citing intelligence leaks that put the number at around 32,000.
That gap between 3,000 and 43,000 shows you just how chaotic the situation on the ground really was.
It's a massive discrepancy.
And it highlights the mechanism the regime used to hide this violence. The timeline points out they initiated a record-breaking internet blackout. They essentially turned the lights out digitally so the rest of the world couldn't see the scale of what was happening. Plus, the sources indicate there were 26,541 arrests during this period.
Over 26,000 people just disappeared into the system. But the thing is, the world did see it, or at least the White House did. And this is where our timeline starts to shift from a tragic domestic issue to a full-blown international crisis.
This is the pivot.
Yeah, we move into mid-January, and the rhetoric just starts to heat up significantly.
Right. On January 13th, President Trump stepped directly into the narrative. He didn't just issue a standard diplomatic condemnation, the usual "we are concerned by the violence" type of statement.
No, he went much further.
He publicly backed the protesters. He explicitly told them, and I quote, "keep protesting and take over your institutions."
Take over your institutions. I mean, that is basically a green light for revolution from the U.S. president.
It is.
He also warned the regime that abusers would, quote, pay a very big price. It really feels like that moment where the political rhetoric starts writing checks that the military has to be ready to cash.
Precisely. And the geopolitics of the region immediately reacted to those signals. You can trace a direct line from those statements on January 13th to the physical movement of military assets.
10 days later.
Exactly, 10 days later. On January 23rd, the rhetoric turned into steel. Trump announced the deployment of an armada.
An armada, that's a really heavy word. Did he specifically use that term?
He did. He called it an armada. And specifically, the source notes he meant the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group.
Right.
Now, for listeners who might not track naval movements closely, a carrier strike group isn't just a big boat. It's essentially a floating air force. It projects power that exceeds the entire militaries of most countries.
It's a massive escalation.
And with that deployment came a list of demands from the U.S. that was essentially a non-starter for the Iranian regime.
Let's list those out because they're important.
They demanded Iran halt all uranium enrichment, cap their missile programs, and completely end all support for their proxies. So that's Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis.
I mean, those aren't negotiation points. Those are demands for total capitulation.
Yeah.
The regime relies on those proxies for its entire regional strategy.
Exactly.
So you have an American carrier group steaming toward the region. You have the Iranian supreme leader reportedly fleeing into a bunker in Tehran. And then you have this other figure re-entering the stage and the sources. Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi.
Yes, the exiled crown prince. The timeline notes that right around this time, he started publicly calling for targeted strikes specifically against the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Wow.
So now you have this massive convergence. The protesters on the street want the regime gone. The exiled opposition leader is actively calling for military strikes, and the U.S. president is moving an armada into place with impossible demands.
And I think for you listening, this is where it gets really fascinating and terrifying to see how these things escalate. In international relations, it's almost never just A leads to B.
No, it's a chain reaction.
All right, A leads to B, which triggers C, which causes D to panic and do something drastic. Because once that carrier group started moving, the friction points started lighting up all over the map.
We call it climbing the escalation ladder. And in late January and early February, everyone started climbing it very quickly. As the USS Abraham Lincoln advanced, the Iranian proxies didn't just back down.
They pushed back.
They did. On January 25th, the Houthis immediately threatened shipping in the Red Sea.
And we started seeing direct kinetic clashes, too. The timeline lists February 3rd as a major warning sign.
That was a busy day.
You had IRGC gunboats actively trying to seize a U.S. tanker, the Skinny Imperative, in the Strait of Hormuz.
Right.
And they were foiled by the USS McFall, which is a U.S. destroyer. But on the exact same day, a U.S. F-35 shot down an Iranian Shahed 139 drone.
These are what military analysts call kinetic events. They aren't a full declared war yet, but they're literal sparks flying around a giant powder keg.
Yeah.
And the Iranians did actually manage to capture 2 foreign tankers near Farsi Island a couple of days later on February 5th.
They took them to Bushehr, right?
Yes, to the port at Bushehr. So the tension is just ratcheting up tighter and tighter. Every single incident creates a decision point where things could easily spiral completely out of control.
But here's the part of the timeline that just drives me crazy, and I bet it drives you listening crazy too. The mixed signals.
Oh, the diplomacy.
Because right in the middle of all this aggressive gunboat diplomacy, there was talk of peace. It felt like we were getting 2 completely different broadcasts at the same time.
The diplomatic roller coaster is honestly dizzying when you read through the Chronicle of Chaos. For example, on February 6th, there were talks in Muscat, Oman, and officials described them as a good start.
A good start. But then just 5 days later, On February 11th, which is the anniversary of the 1979 revolution, you have the Iranian regime organizing massive state rallies featuring anti-U.S. chants.
The rhetoric never cooled down.
And then we get to the cruelest twist of all in this timeline. Look at the entry for just yesterday, February 27th.
This is the detail that really stands out to me in the whole source document. Just yesterday, mediators in Oman claimed that peace was, quote, within reach. They actually reported that Iran had agreed to some nuclear curbs.
Peace is within reach. That was literally yesterday's headline. And today, February 28th, the sky is quite literally falling in Tehran. That is psychological whiplash. How do we go from peace is close to a multinational bombing campaign in 24 hours?
It creates this profound sense of false hope. And looking at the timeline, one really has to wonder, was that diplomacy ever real?
Right.
Was it just a stalling tactic by the regime to buy time to secure their assets? Or perhaps did the U.S. and Israel decide that mere curbs on the nuclear program just weren't enough anymore?
Especially with everything else going on.
Exactly, because the transition from peace is within reach to Operation Epic Fury happened overnight. It strongly suggests the decision to strike was already made while the diplomats were still sitting at the table talking.
So let's talk about today, the breaking point, February 28th. The timeline refers to today's actions as Operation Roaring Lion, which is the Israeli component, and Operation Epic Fury, the American side. And we aren't just talking about hitting a few empty warehouses in the desert.
No, absolutely not. The target list we're seeing is extensive and highly systematic.
It's everywhere.
They hit Tehran, Isfahan, Qum, Karaj, Kermanshah. They went directly after the presidential palace, major IRGC bases, and that strategic port at Bushehr where those tankers were taken. This is clearly a decapitation strategy.
And when you say decapitation, you mean that literally in terms of the regime's leadership.
Yeah.
The source material specifically mentions hitting high-value targets.
Yes. The reports indicate a direct strike on the Supreme Leader's compound, and the source notes it was possibly fatal.
Possibly fatal for Khamenei.
Right. We also have confirmed deaths of top IRGC commanders, specifically Mohammad Pakpour and Ali Shamkhani. If Ali Khamenei is indeed dead, that creates a power vacuum the size of a crater.
It changes everything.
It's not just removing a political leader. It's removing the spiritual and ideological anchor of the entire Islamic Republic system.
But there is another cost here that the source outlines, and we have to look at it. Because we can talk about military strategy and decapitation strikes all day, but the human reality of this is brutal.
It always is.
The timeline notes a specific strike in the city of Manab, and it killed 40 girls.
It's a profound tragedy, and it's the grim reality of this kind of intense warfare. Whether it was a targeted strike that relied on bad intelligence or collateral damage from hitting a nearby military asset, the end result is exactly the same.
40 families destroyed.
Yes. And the source mentions over 70 other civilians killed in various strikes across the country today.
And the immediate fallout for the people who are just trying to survive on the ground, there are explosions lighting up the sky over Tehran, and internet connectivity has dropped to 4%.
4%.
Imagine being in a city under a massive bombardment and being completely cut off from the outside world. You can't call your family to see if they're safe. You can't check the news to see what's happening. You are just completely in the dark while the bombs fall.
It's terrifying to even imagine. And it is important to note from the timeline that Iran didn't just take these hits lying down.
No, they fired back immediately.
The timeline confirms an immediate counterpunch. The regime launched ballistic missiles at Israel and at various U.S. bases across the region.
Right. The sources say there's one injury reported in Israel so far from that retaliation. But the debris from those intercepted missiles, that actually killed civilians in the UAE and in Syria.
It really highlights how inherently regional this conflict is.
Yeah, it's not just two countries fighting in a vacuum. The debris literally falls on everyone else.
And the Houthis are currently hitting targets in the Red Sea as we speak. Israel has activated all its civilian defense shelters. Commercial airspace is entirely shut down across the Middle East.
Nothing is flying except military.
Exactly. This is what a status quo break looks like. The old rules of engagement are just gone.
So let's try to zoom out for a second. What does this all actually mean? If we step back from the burning buildings and the flashing breaking news tickers, we've watched this build up for 2 months in this timeline.
Day by day.
From hungry families protesting the price of goods in December to Operation Epic Fury today in February, what are we actually looking at here?
When you synthesize all the information from the Chronicle of Chaos, you see a violent collision of three massive forces.
Okay.
First, domestic desperation. The Iranian people simply reached a breaking point with their economy and their government. Second, nuclear fears. The West's deep anxiety about Iran's enrichment capabilities finally boiling over.
Right.
And third, proxy warfare. The constant, relentless poking and prodding by groups like the Houthis and Hezbollah, making the region totally unstable.
It's basically a perfect storm where every single geopolitical safety valve failed at the exact same time.
It really is. And U.S. policies shifted incredibly rapidly from engaging in diplomacy to employing what they are now calling decisive force. The speed of that collapse, I mean, from the hope of the omen talks yesterday to the physical destruction of the leadership compounds today is just unprecedented.
And for you listening to this right now, why does this matter to your life? Maybe you're sitting safe in your home thousands of miles away from Tehran. Maybe you're thinking, well, this is just another conflict on the news.
It matters because the status quo of the Middle East, the devil we all knew, for better or worse, is gone. As of this morning, it doesn't exist anymore.
The ripple effects are going to be huge.
Global markets are already bracing for massive oil shocks. Supply chains are going to be severely disrupted. If the Strait of Hormuz closes entirely, the price of literally everything you buy is going to change. But more fundamentally than that, the geopolitical map of the world is being redrawn today.
It really is. We're in completely uncharted waters. And I keep going back to that one specific ambiguity in the source material regarding the supreme leader, the phrase possibly fatal.
That is the biggest question mark of the day.
And that actually leads me to the thought I want to leave you with today. It's a provocative one, based on everything we've read in this timeline.
Let's hear it.
If the supreme leader is indeed dead, and the IRGC leadership has essentially been decapitated, but these strikes also killed innocent civilians, like those 40 schoolgirls in Manab, what happens tomorrow?
It's the ultimate unknown.
Does this foreign intervention actually liberate the domestic protest movement we saw back in January? Does it give the people the chance to finally take over their institutions, like Trump suggested?
Or does it do the opposite?
Right. Does the civilian death toll give the surviving remnants of the regime a brand new rallying cry? Does it turn a grassroots movement for internal freedom into a defensive nationalist war against the West?
That is the critical variable, because when the smoke finally clears tomorrow morning, someone has to control the narrative on the street. Is it going to be the protesters who want a new secular government, or is it going to be the hardliners pointing at the rubble of their cities?
We will just have to wait and see. But for now, the timeline is broken, and we are all just watching the pieces land. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Stay safe out there.